Hi, I'm Elaine Boddy and welcome to my Podbite. Today I'm back in my kitchen and I am surrounded by bowls and ingredients. I am recording this on a Saturday afternoon in the UK and I am preparing for an online class that I'm going to be teaching for Milk Street. So I'm preparing some example doughs at the moment because the classes are dealing with a worldwide audience and Milk Street is in the US. So I am planning doughs once again to be able to have them ready for over 24 hours time. So I'm going to be making some dough again with a very small amount of starter. This is what I was talking about in my previous Podbite episode if you haven't already heard it. So I'm going to be using a very small amount of starter and I'm going to be making a selection of doughs. So I've got in front of me a stack of bowls that I use to make my dough in. And a question that I'm often asked is if I'm making several doughs or a big batch of dough, but how do I do it? So whenever people say to me, can your recipe be easily multiplied up to make 2 or 3 batches or 2 or 3 doughs in one go? My answer is always yes, because my recipe can be very easily scaled up or down, however you want to, as long as you apply the same percentage or scale to the whole set of ingredients. So if you are doubling it, you double all the ingredients, including the starter, all of it. You can very easily do it. And the question of can it be done is always, the answer is yes. But my question will always go back and be, or the answer will be, but do you have a big enough bowl? If you are going to scale up my standard master recipe, which is made with 500 grams of flour, if you're going to scale that up to make 2 or 3 amounts of that dough, you need a big bowl for proving. So this is why if I'm going to make several doughs at once, I use 1 bowl per dough. Partly because that's what I've got and because then it's easier to manage. Doesn't matter if I want to make different doughs, but also then it means that you can still easily see how well your dough is proving. So I'm going to be talking about different flours and grains. So ancient grains, whole grains. I've just got my bowl on the scales here. So let's start off with putting in my bit of starter. So I'm going to be talking about einkorn flour, emmer flour, rye flour, Coruscant, and making various things using those flours, but also talking about the different allowances you need to make for using those flours, because it goes the water going in. Even if they might have still a decent amount of protein, ancient grain flours are not very stable, so they won't hold a dough in the same way. So what you'll see is if you look at any of my recipes that include, say, for example, a portion of einkorn flour or a portion of whole grain spelt flour, it's probably got less water in it unless it's got something like seeds in, because you need to give that dough some firmness for it to be able to hold itself. So these flours are all beautiful. They're beautiful flours to use, but you have to make allowances for them, because at the end of the day, flour is not just flour, which can be quite a lesson to learn when you first start making sourdough. Excuse me, whilst I open a bag of flour. And it was for me, because I just thought flour was flour, because I wasn't a particular baker when I first started making sourdough. I'd never heard of sourdough, that's for sure. So I'm currently making my light rye and chia seed wedge rolls dough, which is in my whole grain sourdough at home book. So we've got some strong white bread flour, we've got some light rye flour, and we've got the full amount of water in this dough, because we've got some chia seeds in there, and the chia seeds will help to soak up some of the water and give the dough some stability. So if you've never used rye flour in your dough before, what you will discover very, very quickly is it's a very different kind of flour to work with. It will make your dough heavy and sticky. Tastes great, but you have to make different allowances for it. So if you want to start using rye flour in a dough, start small. Always, and goes the chia seeds, always start small. If you just want to take my master recipe with 500 grams of strong white bread flour and you want to try using some rye flour, then just replace 50 grams of the flour, the strong white bread flour, with some dark rye flour. See how it feels. The more you replace your strong white bread flour with whole grain flours or ancient grain flours, and whatever amendments you make with water or the liquid, you'll end up needing to bake them in a loaf pan eventually because they just cannot hold their shape. So on my website I have a recipe for 100% whole grain spelt flour loaf, and it's lovely. It's really, really tasty. I developed it specifically for somebody that needed just a 100% whole grain spelt recipe loaf for their son who had an autoimmune illness, and it's lovely. It's a lovely loaf, but it is heavy, and it has to be baked in a loaf pan because that's the only way that it's going to be able to hold its shape. So you don't get a light, airy dough when you're using that much spelt flour or that much in the way of ancient grains. So today I'm going to be making my light rye and chia seed wedge rolls. So I'm going to make the dough for that, and then I'm going to make a dough which has got a portion of strong white bread flour and a portion of whole grain einkorn flour, and then another one which is going to have some strong white bread flour and some emmer grains. I love using grains. You can easily buy spelt grains and wheat grains, often rye grains. Emmer and einkorn and Coruscant ones are not as easy to come by, but if you can get them, oh, they're lovely. They're really lovely, and you can use them in so many ways. I like putting them in dough, but also I like having them with meals instead of rice, for example. And they're chewy, they're lovely, and they're really easy to cook. So I don't cook grains or quinoa or rice in your typical way, so forget what it says on the pack. If you cook quinoa the way that you're told to on the pack, it'll end up mushy and bitter, which is often why people don't like quinoa, because they think it's got a nasty flavour, and it's usually just because of how it's been cooked. So the way that I would cook quinoa, any of these grains, so in front of me I've got some cooked emmer grains that I cooked already, and I've got some cooked rye grains. So simple way of doing it: any cup, whatever cup, take 1 cup full of your uncooked grains, put them in saucepan, refill the cup, so again it's 1 complete cupful of water into the saucepan with your grains, and then put it on your hob or your stove and bring the water to the boil. Then turn the heat down slightly so it simmers, and let the water simmer for 6 minutes. That's all it needs to be, without a lid on. Just let it simmer for 6 minutes. Then turn the heat off, put the lid on, and leave it for 15-20 minutes, and they will continue to cook in the steam, and you'll have really nice fluffy separated grains, particularly when it comes to quinoa. It's not going to be all stuck together. They'll be nice and fluffy, so you can, once you're going to eat them, use your fork, separate them out, and you'll have just beautiful grains. So that's the way that I cook all of mine. So the grains that are in front of me are going to go into another dough. Lots of the flours in front of me are going to go into another one, but I'm also making one of my favorites. So This is my fast spelt dried fruits, nuts and seeds loaf. This is so tasty. So this is a fast loaf. So this isn't one that you need to prove necessarily. You don't need to leave it, particularly for any amount of time. It's a great one if you want to use up any spare starter, if you've made a new starter and you've got any discard. Personally, I don't ever have discard because of the way that I work with my starter. So I feed my starter to generate what I want for my recipe. So in this recipe, we have 100 grams of starter. And what this is doing is giving flavor. This is not in the recipe to lift the dough. It's only there for flavor. And then we've got 400 grams of water. Again, I always talk about my water in terms of grams because I have the bowl on the scales already. And that way you can be a lot more exact with it. So here we go. 400 grams of water. With this recipe, don't worry if it goes over a bit. It's not going to ruin it. Now, this loaf is made with 200 grams of whole grain spelt flour and 300 grams of all-purpose flour. That's how it's written in the recipe, but you could also use 500 grams just of the spelt flour if you wanted to. You could use a mix of ancient grain flours. You can put anything. I have made this recipe with any and every flour I've got. Basically, whatever flour I've got to hand, I have used to make this loaf, and it makes the most fabulous loaf, packed full of dried nuts and seeds, and oh, it's just so good. So we've got the starter, we've got the water, we've got flour. We're then going to have 100 grams of dried figs, all cut in half, 100 grams of dried apricots, again halved, 100 grams of walnuts, halved. You can break them up a bit if you want to. We've also got 100 grams of raisins going in. We've got 100 grams of dried cranberries. In they go. We've got roasted pumpkin seeds. And then we're going to add 1 large egg and some baking soda or bicarbonate of soda and some baking powder. So this is almost kind of cake-like, the way that it's just all mixed up and then baked. But we've got it with the starter in because we are sourdough bakers. Here goes my egg. And this is what we do. And because you get the extra flavour, and you really do get the extra flavour from the starter. And if you've got starter that has been, that has got quite hungry and it's got a lot of flavour to it, I mean, that really, really comes through. So we're going to be adding in the baking soda and the baking powder, and then we are adding a nice set of spice. So we're using mixed spice. You don't have to put any spices in it at all if spices aren't your thing. This is the kind of thing, the kind of loaf that you can really play with. If you don't like all the different bits and pieces I've put in it, you could easily just put in whatever you fancy. Put in the dried fruits that you like, put in nuts that you like, put in seeds that you like. You could put chocolate chips in this. You can do anything. It's just the base of the recipe to keep in mind, because then you can do whatever you like with. So as long as you've got the flour and the liquid, the egg, your baking soda, your baking powder, that is your starting point for which you can then add whatever you like, and then you've got quite a heavy mix here. So it's a really, really lovely, stodgy, heavy mix. So just put it all together. Have your loaf pan ready to go so that you can spoon it in. Just spoon it into the pan. I bake it from cold like everything I do. So it's baked at 180 degrees centigrade if that's on a fan setting, or 200 degrees centigrade if it isn't, which is 350 degrees Fahrenheit or 400 Fahrenheit, and bake it basically for about 50 to 60 minutes, or until a metal skewer comes out of it clean. And then when you take it out, challenge yourself not to cut straight into it. Let it cool for a bit, but it keeps really, really well. You can slice it really thinly or not. Eat it on its own or with a topping. Freezes really well, but it also keeps well for a few days, and it toasts really nicely as well. So this is my fast spelt dried fruit, nuts and seeds loaf. If you would like to know exactly where to find this recipe, please do look at the description on the podcast post for where to find it, or our podcast website, foodbodpod.com, and I will write it up for you. So that's 2 of my doughs down, so I'm going to keep making some more. So the tip is, if you want to make several different doughs, use a different bowl for each one. Makes your life easier, as would make sense. If you want to make several batches of the same dough, use either a very big bowl or several bowls. If you make the batch of dough all in one big bowl, people often ask, when do you then split the dough? Let it prove overnight and then split it the next morning once it's fully proved, because then you know that it's mixed well and you've got this right amount of starter all the way through it. If you mix it all up in the evening and then you split it, you don't necessarily know if you've got starter all the way through. So I would leave it to the next morning, and that's the same with anything. Whenever people say to me, can I make your master recipe and split it in half and do other things with it? The answer is always yes, because you can do anything you like with my recipe, anything. But split it the morning after or after the main prove. That's the time that I would do it. Right, I'm going to stop talking at you and I'm going to keep mixing. So that's been me. This is my Podbite. I hope you enjoy it and talk to you again soon.